Okay, so the Great Swamp has been here for about 14,000 years. And I only have an hour to give you this history, so this is really going to be a broad overview. I like this map because it shows you how the long hill, which is that brown arc across the lower part of the screen, kind of cups the Great Swamp and holds it into place. And Long Hill runs from right here in Chatham all the way around the south and ends just after Millington. The Millington gap breaks through it right down there in the lower left-hand corner, and then it extends a little ways beyond that. Now we're going to go back into time, and this area was covered by glaciers multiple times. But the one we're concerned about today is the last of the glaciers, and that's the Wisconsin Glacier, which was here about 23,000 years ago, 25,000 years ago. And it was many hundreds of feet here. We were completely buried. And Chatham was right at the edge of it. So part of Chatham actually has a terminal moraine. The dirt that the glacier pushed in front of it is right here in Chatham Borough. Now, the glacier started melting its last time about 23,000 years ago. And glaciers melt from both the top and the bottom. And as this glacier melted, it started to produce a huge lake that was held in by the Watchung Mountain. So you see on the picture on the right, you have the first two Watchung Mountains there on the right-hand coast of that lake. And then you see Long Hill sort of sticking up into the middle of it as an island. So Long Hill is anywhere from 200 to 400 feet high. Hence, it's the island there. Now, this lake emptied and filled several times. And the last time it emptied through the Millington Gorge, broke through there. And if you've never been through the Millington Gorge, it's surprising. You don't believe you're in New Jersey because it's this real gorge. So sometime look it up on the map and go visit it. Okay, so why doesn't the Great Swamp water just percolate through the rocks and disappear? Well, it has to do with the bedrock. Now, the brown streaks that you see there, those are the Watchung Mountains, and they're formed of basalt. And this area once had a lot of volcanic activity in it, with layer after layer after layer of lava, which compacts down into basalt. And then the Watchung Mountains were uplifted. So they're not volcanoes themselves, but they are made out of lava. Then the green area that you see inside it, this is siltstone and shale, both of which are pretty much impermeable. So they're going to hold that water in there. The other two types of stone are sandstone and conglomerate. And these are particulate. And it depends on how big the particles are, how much water it allows through. Well, in the Great Swamp, they're a little teeny tiny. So it's pretty much impermeable. So nothing much is going to get through this bedrock. So what's on top of the bedrock? This is a superficial or surface map. This is the stuff that's on top of the bedrock. Now look at the area that's almost to the middle of the map. That is that aqua color and lavender. That is the Great Swamp. And the aqua part of it is freshwater wetland deposit. I can't really. He doesn't know. I don't care. Yeah. Okay, so the blue stuff was deposited in the Great Swamp as the glaciers melted. Because as the glaciers melt, they form these rivers and streams that come out from underneath it. And they bring along a lot of the silt that is underneath the glacier, and that got washed into the Great Swamp. Then the lavender part is lake clay. That lake was there for about 5,000 years. That's a long time. And the silt keeps precipitating out of the water. More gets blown in, it precipitates out. So this is where the clay came from. And you can see that about half of the superficial layer in the swamp is clay. And if you're a gardener, you know water does not move through clay. It has to have other stuff in it to get it to do that. Okay, so now we're talking about people in the Great Swamp, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So during the pre-colonial period, it was pretty good for the Great Swamp, and it was pretty good for people. And the first people who came were the Paleo Indians, who kind of followed the glaciers in as the glaciers receded. So they're coming when the environment is still pretty chilly. When they first got here, there were still woolly mammoths. There were things called moose elk, which were really big, and there were reindeer. So they're going to move in as the lake disappears and a swamp is formed. And they're going to move in here because it's like living next to a big box store. You have absolutely everything you need. You have the water you need to drink, the food that you need to eat, both vegetable and protein, and you have the materials to make your houses out of, and you have what you need to make your clothing as well, the animals that you kill. So it was a really, really great place for them to live. And we know they were here because of archaeological digs that have occurred. One of them several decades ago was done at the end of Britain Road in Green Village. And it was a Paleo Indian site. Now, we're not sure when the Paleo Indians became the Lenape, when they became their own individual people with their individual language, but they are the people who lived here before us, and we should be appreciative of that. And so they followed in the footsteps of the Paleo Indians, and we know they were here because in a lot of the farmland around here, you can't push a plow through there without turning up spear points and arrowheads. And the collection that we have at the Red Brick Schoolhouse, the majority of it came from Schwartz Farm when they were still planting corn and hay there. And they turned up arrowheads all the time. It got so they were kind of blasé about it. And some of the others from that we have are from other areas around the swamp. The neat thing about stone tools is they don't degrade. They're hard to date, but the arrowheads you actually can date based on the way they are actually made and the rock that they're made from and stuff. We do not have artificial. Now, their housing was made very simply. They lived in hogans, which usually had more than one family in them. They would use saplings as the rafters, and they would push both ends in to form these arches. In the winter, it was covered with bark. In the summer, it was covered with woven grass mat. So it was a perfect place to live where they were, just perfect. Now, the corn, squash, and beans that we eat today actually came from South America. And they were developed by the native peoples down there. And they worked their way up South America, across North America, and eventually ended up here in New Jersey. So that the Lenape moved from being hunter-gatherers to being, to a large part, an agricultural people. So the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash, corn is planted first, and the stalk comes up. The beans are planted next that use the corn as the beanstalk. And the squash is planted then because the big leaves actually shade the soil and keep the moisture in. And they also prevent a lot of the weeds from growing. So this work of the three sisters together was just perfect. And it was used from the Southwest, the dry Southwest, all the way up into Massachusetts. And it kind of ended there because the growing season wasn't quite long enough when you got further north than that. Now, last of all, remember I talked about the clay. The Lenape took advantage of the clay that they had as well. And they used the rope method where you just made a long snake and then you coil it around and you could dry it in the sun or bake it somewhat. So they took advantage of everything. Okay, the colonial period. Good for some people, not so good for others, and not so good for the Great Swamp. And of course, the people it was not so good for were the Lenape. So the Lenape were pushed off by the land starting in 1708, when 30,000 acres of land, including parts of the Great Swamp and the surrounding area, were purchased for 15 kettles, 4 pistols, 4 cutlasses, some rum, and some patch. And we pretty much see the Lenape disappear after that. The colonials begin settling around the swamp for exactly the same reason the Lenape were there. It was the big box store. You just couldn't beat it. And of course, they're using a lot of wood out of the Great Swamp because they need it for all of the things that you see listed there, including charcoal. You need to use wood to create charcoal for running the forges and blacksmiths. You have to produce your own tools. Now, this is the type of building the first settlers would have built in this area, and is referred to as an East Jersey cottage, and it's very particular to our area. And most of them were built like the Bachhoven cottage there on the left, with 2 windows and a door. The other building was probably built that way, but expanded later because it was really easy to add on to the side of it. So you'd have 2 rooms downstairs. You would have the parlor in the front. That's where you talk to your neighbors and things like that. And then in the back, you had the kitchen. That's essentially where you live. Upstairs was sleeping area and storage area. And you had a single chimney and 2 fireplaces, one for the front room and one for the kitchen. And the kitchen one would have been a massive fireplace. So you had plenty of room to cook. Mother could practically step inside the thing. Now, one of the really interesting things that happened when the Europeans first arrived in this country is they discovered their axes were no good. The English felling axe is there on the left, and the American felling right axe is on the left. So what is the difference between these? In Europe, there were no big trees left. What few big trees there were belonged to the crown, and you were not cutting those down. So your axe was cutting down smaller trees. So you can see that by the cross section at the top, that where the eye is, where the handle comes in, there's very little axe head behind that. And it goes from round and then straight down to the blade. So when that blade gets buried in the tree, it's going to stop with a real sharp, hard jolt because of that round stop there. The blade is narrower, it's longer, and the handle is absolutely straight. So when they tried to use these axes on trees here, these great big trees, it was horrible. They might have well been using stone axes. So what they learned very quickly is they had to modify their axe shape. And the first thing they did was they put more of the axe head behind the eye. And this gives you more power coming from the axe itself. So you don't have to use as much of your own muscle. Second, the axe blade is shorter and wider. And it has a very nice outline to it, so you never come to a jolt when you stop, when you get the axe as far in as you could. And then the axe handle became biodynamic, so it actually worked with humans again. So one of the things that they would have been using these axes for is to create charcoal. And charcoal has to be used when you're working with iron, because burning wood will never get hot enough to be able to melt the iron or to soften the iron so you can work it. So they would make charcoal, and this is an ancient method that was developed in Europe. And you need 4-foot long pieces of seasoned hardwood, about 6 to 8 inches round, and you start creating this stack with them. And anywhere from 50 to 90 cords were used to create this stack. And then they would cover it with dirt so there weren't drafts. And then they would light the wood from underneath. And the wood would start to burn very slowly, 20 to 40 days, depending on how many cords are in there. And then when they finally opened it up, you would have about 700 pounds of charcoal per cord of wood. So this is the charcoal that you needed to run your torches. And a lot of the Great Swamp fell to the charcoal burners. I apologize, I'm getting over bronchitis. Okay, let's look at the Revolutionary War now. Good for patriots, not so good for loyalists, not so good for the Great Swamp. Now, because Washington spent 2 winters here with his Continental Army, the swamp provided a lot of fuel and a lot of food, so it was hard on the Great Swamp. But the positive thing about it was that the geography really worked for George Washington and his troops. So let me help you through this map. This is 1777, and this is just a part of this map that was all of New Jersey. So we're seeing about a quarter of it. There are very few geological formations that they mark on this map. Most of it is rivers and towns. But 2 of the geographical ones are the Great Swamp and Long Hill. And you can see them below Morristown. They didn't mark the rest of the watch homes. I'm not sure why. But why did they mark these? Because these were really important. These were a natural barricade, and they were a barricade to the British down in New Brunswick. So with the 3 ranges of the Watchung Mountains, including Long Hill, and the Great Swamp as a moat, they could not get to George Washington and his troops from the south. Now, from the east, where the British were in Staten Island and New York, the only way through the Watchung Mountains was Hobart Gap. That's that gap in the hills over by Summit, where 24 comes through, and it used to be much, much narrower than that. So that was the only way through. So hence, the British made one sincere try to get to Morristown, and that ended up in the Battle of Springfield, which the Americans were able to drive them back. And troops from Chatham were actually participating in that. Now, Washington probably learned about the Great Swamp and the Watchung Mountains from William Alexander Lord Stirling, who was one of his generals. And he owned most of the Great Swamp at that time. And he had his house over on what is now Lord Stirling Road, that eventually becomes White Bridge Road. And the house is no longer there. I think some pieces of the foundation and stuff are, and some archaeological work is being done over there now. But poor Lord Stirling, he was very bad with his money, and he eventually lost all of his land. The post-revolutionary period, but for people, it's getting worse for the poor Great Swamp, because there are more and more people who want more houses, outbuildings, all the pieces that go into building houses and heating them, etc. So the Great Swamp is getting lots and lots more attention. Now, this is a fantastic map, and we have 2 copies of this at the Historical Society. This is by John Littell. And this man was probably the luckiest person that existed at that time because he knew all of these boundaries. He knew where everybody lived. And he also wrote a genealogy of most of them. So I just love this man. Now, what's cool about this map is it not only shows you all of the boundaries of people's land, but he set their names in there. So we know who owned the land in 1846. It's terrific. And you can see the Passaic River looping along there, starting up at the top, looping down through the Great Swamp, coming through the Millington Gorge way on the left, and then it goes all the way across the middle in that wiggle waggle form and leaves the map at Chatham. Now I'm going to show you another version of this where I have drawn a blue line across the peak of Long Hill. So this is Long Hill going from Chatham to just past Millington. And all of those red dots, so the Great Swamp is from just above that blue line to nearly the top of the map, and each of those red dots is a homestead. So in 1845, there were already this many people living in and farming in the Great Swamp. And if you think about what the Great Swamp looks today, where would you find that farmland? The way you found it was you built ditches and dikes, you drained the land, and then you kept it drained. So it was hard work farming in there. Now I'm going to go to a part that is up in the upper right hand part of this map. I'm going to show you this in a little bit more detail. The road that you see along the right hand side is Southern Boulevard. The one across the top is Spring Village Road. And this is showing you this grid of lots, lots there. Those are woodlots. And the little wedge-shaped things below it, those are woodlots. Well, if you owned a farm, you'd probably cleared most of the trees off of your farm, except a few around your house. And if you lived in town, you had no trees at all, except, a few of them that you want to keep standing there. So where do you get the wood for your fireplace, for heating and for cooking? You own a woodlot. So if you lived in town, you owned a woodlot out in the Great Swamp. And if you sold your house, the woodlot went with it. If you were a farmer, you might own several of those woodlots, and you'd send your oldest kid out there to cut down the wood. You'd keep replanting it with fast-growing things like poplars, so that you had this continuous turnover of wood, and you would always have wood. And this was true until coal came along, and we could start heating our homes with coal and cooking in cast iron stoves. All right, so we've been talking so far about cutting down wood as charcoal or for heating and things like that. But what about the wood you needed to build houses? Now, my sister and I live in a 250-year-old East Jersey cottage, and we can look at the beams underneath and in the attic, and we see the axe marks, because these were built 250 years ago, and there were no sawmills then. But that's a really hard way to build a house, and you need a lot of friends to build a house that way. So you needed to start having a method for cutting good lumber for building your house with. So the method that the English and other Europeans used was first imported, and you can see this two-man saw, one guy on the left-hand side, one guy's at the top, one guy's at the bottom, and you can see there are braces down either side. And this is making sure that the blade goes right down the middle. So you have two pieces that are the same size when you finish cutting them. Now think about this poor guy down there in the hole. You know he's the lowest of the low, the employee. And just think about what it must have been like for him in the summer. Just, horrible, horrible. So one of the great things about New Jersey is we have a lot of streams and rivers. And it doesn't matter if the stream doesn't have a lot of change of grade. It doesn't have to move very fast, and it doesn't have to change altitude very much, because we can build dams. So if you had a stream that you wanted to put a water wheel and a sawmill on, you would build a dam And the water would build up behind that. And you would also have a sluiceway next to it. And the water is forced into that little narrow passage by the weight of the lake behind it. And because it's narrow, it's going to go really fast and hard. So it's going to be able to move that water wheel you see on the bottom right of the right-hand picture. And the first sawmill had the up and down saws, like you see with the guys in the pit. And they would have small saw blades that could do the finishing work. But a water wheel cannot move these big blades that you see, the much bigger ones. So we had to wait until steam engines came along before you could start using the really big saw blades. So when the steam engines came along, then we didn't need the water wheels anymore. Now, one of the sawmills that was on John Littell's map is this one that we see that was over on the far left upper side. And this is Osborne Pond. If any of you drive from Chatham to Basking Ridge on Lee's Hill Road, as you come around that big curve, that's Osborne Pond where AT&T was, and I don't remember who owns it now. But Osborne Pond is the thing that kind of looks like a dead bagpipe up there. And you can see at the very end of it, if you get out your binoculars, you can read sawmill. So that's the Passaic River coming down from the north. They dammed it up. They now have Osborne Pond. And then it went through the sluice, ran the water wheel, and then it was sent off into the Great Swamp. And I have not yet found when this was first built, when the dam was first put in, or who owned it first. The earliest person I found was Mr. Rickey, followed by several Bears, followed by Osborne, followed by James Baird, who turned it into a pumping station to provide drinking water for Basking Ridge. And later, the town of Basking Ridge bought it outright. Now, here's another one that is closer to home, another deflated bagpipe here. This is Samuel Roberts' mill on Dixon's Mill Road. So if you drive through Green Village and keep going straight, you'll end up on Dixon's Mill Road. And you'll get to a little bridge, and that's where one of the mills was. But if you go off the map here and cross Blue Mill Road, you will be at what everybody calls Silver Lake. So that was a dam, and across the street, the house still stands. It was the mill owner's house, and it was originally a forge. Then the dam was built, and I believe it became a grist mill. So then it becomes a stream again after it passes under the road, and further down, we then get to another dam that was built just beyond the little bridge that still stands on Dixon's Mill Road, and there is a historic marker there that tells you about it. So this is the second dam in a very short order on a small stream, both of which were able to turn water wheels. Now, he did start out with a sawmill, and here's a version of it. I don't know the date of the picture, but the house that is there on the left, that still stands. The buildings to the right where the mill, that's gone, as is the dam that stretches over in the center right-hand side, and you can see the mill pond behind it. So this is all a stream now again, but after a hurricane, I love going over there because it fills the meadow. It's just gorgeous. So this was run by enslaved people. He had, at the highest, there were about 11 living there on his property in a small house behind his house. So once after the Civil War, a number of his people did remain with him because what else do you do? How do you go and get a job? What you've been as a slave owner. So this was a sawmill until the wood really started to run out in the Great Swamp. Then he turned it into a cider mill because there were still a lot of apple orchards around. Now, along comes steam. This is a great thing for the guys who want to cut wood because you've got a steam engine. It can run these big blades that you see there. And what's really cool about it is you can make them move. So you put this big steam engine on a sledge and horses and oxen can pull it, and you do the same thing with the sawmill part of it. So you have these two big pieces of equipment, you drag them in, and you just do the part. And that's what they did. Okay, let's look at the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s. Poor Great Swamp, it's just getting worse and worse. Okay, this is one of the last sawmills around. This was William DeMott's sawmill in Green Village. It stood where the Green Village Fire Department now stands. He ran a sawmill on the first floor and a peach basket factory on the second, because now you're getting down to some pretty little wood, and you can make peach baskets out of it. There was a big peach industry here for quite a while, but there was also a lot on the East Coast, all the way down to Georgia and that area. So these peach baskets went everywhere. Now, okay, so let's look at, oh, and by the way, he finally retired. He retired in 1928, and there were one or two other mills that I'll talk about in a few minutes, but that was the end of the sawmills in that area. And the building burned down a couple of years after that, probably as a result of arson. Okay, now we're looking at an 1868 map, and this is the Great Swamp you're looking at. And look at how many homes are marked on that. Well, these were farm families. Farm families had big families who needed help on the farm. So you had a lot of kids. And you gotta have schools for these kids because the little ones can't walk too far, and you don't have motors yet. So the kids have got to walk. And the red arrows that you see there are the schools around and in the Great Swamp. And the one that is second from the bottom, that is this one on the left-hand side, Pleasant Plains School. It was at the crossroads of Pleasant Plains and White Bridge Road. It still stands, but it is a private home. So I have not yet found when it was built, but that picture is from about 1900. Directly across the street from it was the Pleasant Plains Methodist Episcopal Church. It does not stand, but its foundations are hidden right across the street in the underbrush. This is a photograph in 1906 of you're standing with your back to Long Hill, looking down at Myersville. And you're seeing the church there, it's still in Myersville. And the house that's just up and to the left of it, that house still stands. But you're looking across the swamp and look at how few trees are there. Lots and lots of trees are gone. There's still quite a few over there to the right-hand side. And in a minute, we'll see why they're still there. So much of the swamp has been denuded. This is the very, very last of the sawmill, the Sanders Mill, and it's marked there with the red arrow. And this existed where there is no longer road because this is part of the wilderness of the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. So it started out, there's this stream going by, and it started out as a water mill, and it was then turned into steam. And here he is with his big blade there on the lower right-hand side. And he was the very last one. Mr. Zander was it. And when he retired in 1968, they sold the land to the refuge. This is a neat picture because this is the whole Great Swamp in front of you. And this is a 1900, and it's showing you the forested and swampy areas and the clear areas of the Great Swamp. So the white is cleared land, pasture or cropland. The gray is very wet. You could probably grow some lowland hay there. And then the green parts are true swamp. A swamp is water with trees. A marsh is water without trees. So this is true swamp here. Now, a lot of the cleared area, especially near Green Village and Chatham, was owned by Louis Noe and his brother-in-law, Samuel Brandt. Samuel's down there on the right. And they had this huge peach growing business, and they sold peach wicks, baby trees as well. And Noe in particular was known nationally for his peach breeding and that he was just sort of the top-notch horticulturalist when it came to that. So he was one of the first people on the East Coast to find out that there was this nasty disease coming that was going to wipe out the peach orchard. And so he sold his part of his business to his brother-in-law. And he said, stop growing roses. Well, it just so happens that Samuel got through it anyway because he had a lot of other kinds of fruit that was not subjected to sale. So he did survive after all. Now, another thing that the swamp was very good at producing was bricks. We're back to the clay. And you can see here on this 1853 map, there's brickyard. And those bricks were used to build that wonderful old church on Main Street in Basking Ridge. And you can still go and rub your hands over those bricks today. And that was actually the third building that was built there. And 1839 was when that building was built. So we know the brickyard was there long before this map was made, but I have not yet found out when the brickyard was no longer in work. So here again, you see, we're just reiterating where that clay is. And the clay was used not only for making bricks, but there was a gentleman by the name of Anzi Leonard who lived pretty close to where Osborne Pond is. There's a road that goes off to the right there just before you get to Osborne Pond, and there's a triangle there. And he lived just beyond the triangle. And he had a pottery business where he made tile drainage pipes. Probably a lot of the pipes that helped cut the swamp drain for so long. And when he retired, he sold it to a Eugene Hoffman. He and his son eventually installed modern machinery, and they made flower pots galore, lots and lots of them until the business closed in 1957. Now let's look at the Great Swamp as quote unquote worthless land. There have been any number of times when there was talk of turning the Great Swamp into a reservoir. And this first came up in newspapers in the 1890s. And they talked of building the dam in the Millington Gorge and just backing up the Passaic River from there. It shows up again in 1922, in 1928. And in the 20s, it starts to be talked about as water for the cities to the east. And then in the years when they were planning to put in the Washington Valley Reservoir, which would drown really good farmland, actually, there was a letter to the editors that said, why not use the Great Swamp? It's worthless land. So that was the opinion of the Great Swamp in those days. Now, also, not only do you have this swamp that just people think is not worth very much, it has mosquitoes and it causes flooding. Now, anytime you have a swamp, you have mosquitoes. It's a fact of life. Anytime you have a river, you have a floodplain. Get the name floodplain? Well, the people who build their houses there apparently don't. So when you move to this floodplain or next to a swamp, suddenly you don't want floods and you don't want mosquitoes. So there was frequently talk about draining the Great Swamp to get rid of the flooding problem and the mosquitoes. They obviously didn't have a very good idea of the hydrology of the Great Swamp because there's a huge watershed behind it that produces a tremendous amount of water. So there became a little bit more realistic response to this situation in the 1930s during the Depression, when FDR comes into office and he creates the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Civilian Works Administration. And in this case, they had a whole bunch of people. One group was all World War I veterans, because remember, we had World War II, and these were guys who needed jobs. A lot of them were very young men who didn't have any jobs. And one of the things that they did was they deepened the channels coming out of the Great Swamp. They cleaned up the Passaic River so that the water could move through it. So in the you can't think of the Great Swamp as water that stands still. Swamps are not supposed to stand still. They're actually an extremely slow moving river. And the original Great Swamp did that. So the humans who went in there and rearranged everything stopped that. So sending these guys in to dig some ditches was supposed to help them. Now I hope you can see the very faint blue lines against the green here. This is the current waterways in the Great Swamp. And if you look carefully up to the upper right, you can see this is Black Brook that comes down. That is unnaturally straight. That was made by human hands. There are some to the bottom of the picture as well. And in several other places, anywhere you see these straight lines, those are not natural. So these still exist. And this was from this time when it was being used first as farmland. And then they were trying to recreate this slow moving river. Okay, so now we have the Great Swamp as wilderness, because even before it was designated wilderness, it was wilderness. So anytime you have wilderness, you're going to have people who are going to use it. And as long as there were kids with ice skates and winters with ice, those kids went to the swamp. And they'd spend the entire day there. Mother wouldn't see them until nighttime. And I've heard some from people who not terribly long ago that they used to walk all the way across the swamp because it was completely frozen. Now, of course, there was a lot of hunting, just like the Paleo Indians and the Lenape used it, and the colonials. So there was so much hunting of deer and depletion of their native habitat that deer became essentially extinct in our area. The hunting season was stopped in 1902 to 1909, and from 1902 to 1913, the state was actually restocked with deer from private deer farms in Pennsylvania and Michigan. We actually had to import the deer. Now, the other thing that people, of course, hunted, ducks, geese, other kinds of birds, rabbits, squirrels, raccoons, anything you would put on your dinner plate, they would hunt it. The other thing they hunted were berries, and the Great Swamp still has blueberries and huckleberries tucked down inside it. And during the holiday season, a lot of scout groups would go and harvest holly and laurel to sell. That was a big fundraiser. But it got to be that it was getting so rare that these groups actually said, we're not going to do this anymore. We got to let this stuff grow back. So that was the end of that. Now, if you're going to send people off into the wilderness, some of them are even people who know the swamp really, really well. They're still going to get lost sometimes. So when you sit there and read through newspapers.com, it's always fun to see, oh, there's another one. No, there's another one. They got lost too. Bird watching. there have always been bird lovers, and so therefore there have always been bird lovers in the Great Swamp. One of the great things about the Great Swamp is it's on the Eastern Flyway. So we see all the migratory birds. It's just fabulous. Now, another thing that was greatly appreciated there was the insects. Now, we often think of, oh, there's nothing but mosquitoes in there. Oh, fabulous, fabulous insects in there. And this gentleman that we see here in the two pictures on the left, this is Charles Rummel. He was a self-educated entomologist from Germany who lived in Green Village for a number of years. He loved teaching kids about insects. And he would take scout troops in. He would mentor kids. And there are two people there on the right who he mentored. And this is Lincoln Brower and Jane Van Zandt. They both went on to get doctorates in entomology. They married but later divorced. Lincoln Brower was the preeminent man for researching the monarch butterflies, their migration, and the effects of their coloration. And when he died a few years ago, not too long ago, his son, Andy, wrote an article about him in one of the entomology journals, and he said, quote, as a youth, Brower began a collection of butterflies and moths, mentored by Charles Rummel, who had a penchant for building ingenious gadgets, including an air pump to blow up caterpillars, beautifully crafted pinning boards, and a trigger and trapdoor killing jar lid apparatus for capturing moths one-handed from a baited tree, which was otherwise a three-handed operation, one to hold the jar, one the lid, and one the flashlight. Many of these treasures are still in use. Now, a lot of the kids in the Green Village area, and we live right across from the Great Swamp, so my brothers were swamp rats as they grew up. And we have a family story where our brother brought home a tree frog one day and stuck it in one of his terrariums, of which he had many. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, this thing starts to call. And it sounds like something from outer space is about to land. Well, the family got him up immediately. He didn't even get to change out of his pajamas before he took that thing back into the swamp. Okay. Now we've done the good and the bad, and now we're coming to the dumbest, ugliest idea ever. I think you guys probably know what it is. And that was the idea of building a jetport in the middle of the Great Swamp. And this is a rendering of what it would look like. The dotted line shows you the area that would have been taken by eminent domain. As you can see, the demise of Green Village, New Vernon, Myersville, and then the straight black lines are the runways, and the cones are the flight paths. So you can look at that and say, oh yeah, I would have been right on that one. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen Scott Morris's film, Saving the Great Swamp. Scott is from Chatham, and Larry Fast, who co-produced it with him, is from Long Hill. And if you haven't seen this film, you can rent it right here in this building. And even though you know the end of the story, it's still a cliffhanger. It's wonderfully done. And it was based on Pam Cavanaugh's book, Saving the Great Swamp, which she published in 1978. And her book, you think, oh man, it's all politics and law and stuff like that. It is so readable that if you, and I believe you can get a copy here because it is out of print, and you're going to be hard put to buy it online because every copy of it we see the Historical Society buys. So good luck finding one. You can find it online, and I'm sorry, my right there. That is where you can find it online on that link. So you can actually read it online because it is out of print. Okay, so You need to take them. Or more than that. Not get ready. You understand me? Okay, so. Took Scott Morris an hour to tell me the story, and it took Kevin Kavanaugh an entire book. I'm going to tell you the story in less than 7 minutes. So, yeah. They say in the Wizard of Oz, hold on to your hat, hold on to your heart. Here we go. In December of 1957, a representative of the Port Authority of New York contacted the Newark Evening News concerning a plan to build a jetport in the Great Swamp. The rep made it clear that they expected the newspaper to make this plan look like a good idea. Well, the news editor wasn't so sure it was a good idea, but he knew a great story when he saw one. So he splashed it across the front page of the newspaper above the fold. North Jersey, not to mention the locals, freaked out. Backlash was immediate. Within 1 week, a meeting in the Madison High School was overflowing crowd. The audience learned that Austin Tobin, the king of the Port Authority, intended to take 10,000 acres of Great Swamp by eminent domain. This would obliterate, and Austin Tobin was good at eminent domain. This would obliterate Green Village, Myersville, part of New Vernon Village, parts of Chatham Township, Basking Ridge, Madison. These early jets were so loud and polluting, they would make life miserable for anyone who was still there. And it was recommended that no town exist within 5 miles of one of these airports. The jetport would have 4 runways, each one 12,000 feet to accommodate the jet. The Port Authority only had authority over a 25-mile circle around the Statue of Liberty, and Great Swamp was a mile 26. So the Port Authority had to get approval of the state legislatures and governors of both New Jersey and New York. Well, most of the New Jersey legislatures were definitely against this, but Governor Minor declared himself as non-committal. So Austin Tobin was not concerned because he said, I always win. The New Jersey Jetports Association, the JJSA, created and headed by Representative Peter Frelinghuysen, its purpose was to convince local, state, and federal politicians that this was a very bad idea. Peter Frelinghuysen, Austin Tobin was not concerned. He counted on, quote, public apathy and a drop in interest following the first burst of jetport opposition, unquote. Then the New Jersey State Legislature passed a resolution to oppose the jetport in Morris County. Austin Tobin shrugged. He said he was never beaten. The JJSA convinced U.S. Congressman Emanuel Sellers of New York to encourage the U.S. Congress to examine the New York Port Authority's policies, procedures, and integrity. Austin Tobin refused to provide Congress with the requested documents, and he was indicted for contempt of Congress. Meanwhile, Marcellus Hartley Dodd, lifelong conservationists, have been quietly buying up 1,000 acres of land in the swamp piecemeal in strategic places. In September 1960, he donated the land to the U.S. Department of the Interior for a wildlife sanctuary because Marcy Dodge knew that you cannot condemn federal land. So at the same time, expert consultants commissioned by Hardin Township, Chatham, and Morris County found that no jetport was actually needed. The Port Authority's analysis was wrong. Austin Tobin ignored them. In 1961, the Great Swamp Committee of the North American Wildlife Federation was created with Helen Fenske as the executive secretary and Marcy Dodge as the honorary director. The group became expert at educating the public about the value and richness of the Great Swamp. Grace Hand and Swampy Joe Roy became the polished presenters and gave tours of the Great Swamp. Helen Fenske became a master of working telephones. The New Jersey legislature passed a law prohibiting the building of an airport for interstate or international use in 7 counties in New Jersey, including Morris. Non-committed Governor Minor vetoed the bill, coming out as again for the jetport because it provided union jobs. Soon after, the regional director of the U.S. Fish and Game, John Gottschalk, told the Great Swamp Committee that 2,000 acres would get in active management in the Great Swamp, and 3,000 acres would be needed to guarantee a national wildlife refuge. So the Great Swamp Committee and others had money to purchase 1,000 more acres, so they ended up with 2,000, and a field office was opened in the Great Swamp in November of 1961. Still needed about 900 acres to make the 300-acre allotment. Stuart Udall becomes the Secretary of the Interior under JFK in 1961, and in 1963 he published a book, The Quiet Crisis, about how America's rich natural resources were at serious risk. It acted as a stimulus to the public support of saving the Great Swamp, and the money rolled in. It was good timing because Austin Tobin renewed his threat, claiming a jetport was still needed and only the Great Swamp would do. The Great Swamp Committee, Helen Penske and co-workers, went after the big donors and got them. In the spring of 1964, Stuart Udall dedicated the refuge. But guess what? Austin Tobin wasn't done yet. He was like the Terminator. He just kept standing up. 2 years after the dedication, Tobin claimed the refuge could coexist with the airport. After all, there were refuges around other airports, so he recommended that the 3,000 acres of the refuge be exchanged for 3,000 acres outside of it. It's not in the Great Swamp anymore. So Austin Tobin would not let the Great Swamp just be. Luckily, Lyndon Johnson had signed the Wilderness Act in 1964, the highest form of protection for land. No man-made structures, no fuel-powered machines were allowed. The Great Swamp Committee saw its chance. Peter Frelinghuysen, with Helen Penske at his side, led the efforts to convince Congress that an area in the middle of suburbia could indeed be a wilderness, and they succeeded. On September 30 of 1968, Lyndon Johnson signed the Great Swamp Wilderness Act, and the fight was over. Austin Tobin lost, and the Great Swamp won. The surprise, surprise, the reports that no major jetport was needed were absolutely true. There has never been a fourth jetport built in this metropolitan area. Mm-hmm. That's it. Not up on PBS yet, working with them, so but you can go online to AmericanRiver.com to see any areas where it is being shown. Keep an eye out for it. It shows up every now and then up here at Hickory Tree. It's just a wonderful movie, and it's about our Passaic River, our own river. So it's easy. Cool. Say,
PBS, yeah.
oh, great. Speak up. Real loud.
On Wednesday.
Wednesday?
On Wednesday, I'm not positive.
Oh, great. Thank you, Renee. Thank you. All right. If you have any questions, or if you have any questions online, you can unmute yourself online if you'd like to. And let me start sharing. There we go. So I can see you. Or does anybody have any questions here? Yeah. Oh, Logansville. All right. You're going to drive from. You're going to leave New Vernon on Lee's Hill Road. So you're driving straight towards Basking Ridge. You don't quite get there, and there's this group of houses. That was Logansville. Yeah, and there are several old East Jersey cottages there, and there's a stable that's called Logansville, and that's how you recognize it there. And there are a bunch of little villages. They were hamlets, they're called. And they might have a school. They might have a school that's connected to the church, but it's something like a collection of little houses.
Didn't do anything.
Anyone else? Yes. Yes, it will be available online here at the library. Yep. Yep, it is being recorded. And it's also already online with the Friends of the Great Swamp. So if you go to the Friends, go to YouTube and just type that title in, it's already there with the Friends of the Great Swamp. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much.